Am I on now? Thank you. I'm going to ask if you'll go ahead and get your refreshments and be seated. And those of you at the table here, if you would finish up, because we really would like for the governor to speak. We are so happy to have former Georgia Governor Nathan Deal with us this morning. He has written a children's book, Vito the Governor's Cat, and perhaps you are already familiar with it. But I just don't think Governor Deal needs any further introduction. I'm so glad so many of his friends are here today, and thank you for coming. Whenever you're ready. Write faster.
I'm coming. Okay. Stop. Yeah. I'll stop right there. Get one of the books. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank y'all for having me this morning. It's good to see so many friends that I've had over the years. I appreciate you coming out today. This is a new experience for me in many regards. I'll tell you the story behind the story. Those are always the best stories, the ones behind the scenes that are not really written down. I just got back from a book signing tour. We went down and made a swing through Perry and down to Valdosta, and I didn't realize how big this state was. I'd gotten out of the campaign mode, but it's a long way from Valdosta back up to Habersham County, which is where I live. My middle daughter, Carrie, is with me today. She's the one that does most of my driving lately. She doesn't trust me to get too far away from home, but she lives with me. We had a cabin up in Habersham County on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, and when we got ready to retire after we were leaving the governor's office, we decided that was probably the better place for us to be. It's a beautiful spot on the river, and so we tried to figure out how the old cabin could be modernized and made more handicapped accessible, and we decided finally we couldn't do that, so the county said, okay, we'll let you take it down and build back on the same spot. So that's what we did. Sandra got to live there for about 4 years, but she passed away in 2022 of brain cancer. Now, the origins of this book are such that many people say, well, this is not normal for a politician to be writing children's books. And that's true. They said, why haven't you written your memoirs? And I said, well, I started on them, but I realized pretty quick that a lot of people had to die before I was able to really publish my memoirs, or I'd be in really big trouble. But when Sandra was First Lady, of course, she was a public school teacher here in Hall County. And thanks to the school board members and to Will Schofield, the school superintendent, many of you may know that they built a new elementary school right off of 365, and they dedicated it, and it's named the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Elementary School. It is a combination of Riverbend and White Sulphur. They are consolidated into that new school. And somewhat ironically, where it's located is only about a mile from where Sandra grew up, so it's very appropriate. She retired from the public school system in Hall County as a middle school teacher, and then when I was elected governor, she became, obviously by title, the First Lady of Georgia. Now, she had campaigned all over the state, as had I. And then when we were elected, everybody said, well, Ms. Deal, what are you going to do now? And she said, well, one thing for sure, I'm not going to sit in the governor's mansion and sip tea and drink and eat cookies. So they said, well, what do you want to do? She decided that she wanted to make literacy her project. And with most things that she did it wholeheartedly. She started reading to children, reading children's books to them, because she thought that was the best way she could stimulate their interest in wanting to learn to read themselves. And I agree that that's probably one of the better ways that you could do it. She got She covered the state thoroughly. She read a book in every one of our 159 counties, in every one of our 181 school systems, and over 1,000 individual classrooms. We estimate about 250,000 Georgia students heard her read a children's book. Well, when we left office in 2019, she was still receiving requests to come read to schools, read to libraries, and that sort of thing. And she asked me one day, she said, I want you to write me a children's book. I've read all the good ones that I have, and I want you to write me one. Well, you know how us husbands are. We'll promise our wives most anything just to get them to leave us alone for a little while. So I told her I would, and promptly forgot to do it, and didn't do anything about it until about a year or so after that. She got brain cancer diagnosis, and I realized that I needed to get busy. Excuse me. So I got busy, and I wrote it in its original form. I got to read it to her. She liked it, gave me the thumbs up, and that was my authorization to go forward with the book. She always said that she wanted a children's book that was written by a Georgia author, in this case it's me, illustrated by a Georgia illustrator, and the illustrations in the book are by Cheryl Hodge from over in Rome, Georgia. She is a watercolorist and a very good one. Her husband, Al, has been very active in Chamber of Commerce activities and economic development activities all across the state. So a lot of people know Al, and she is his wife. So she did the illustrations, and then she said, I want it published by a Georgia publishing company. We found a company, and I highly recommend them. They were very easy to work with. Their name is Book Logics with an X on the end, and they're located in Alpharetta, Georgia. And so they did a very good job for us, and they're start to finish. They help you with the editing, they do the compilations, and then they publish it, they print it, and they'll ship it. So it was a full operation. But anyway, that's the way the book came about. Now, it's a true story. In fact, in its original form, it was all true. It's a story of our experiences as told through the mouth and eyes of Vito the cat. Well, let me back up. I didn't name them that. I don't know who named them Bill and Vito, but very appropriate names, I guess, for governor's cats. Anyway, the beginning of this book, it talks about Bill and Vito being born, and they were born on the farm of my chief of staff, Chris Riley, off of Clarks Bridge Road up in Hall County. He had a mama cat, she had a litter of kittens, and we had a chipmunk problem at the governor's mansion. We had chipmunks ate everything, and we couldn't have a garden, couldn't have berries, couldn't have anything. They just ate everything. And so Chris said, I believe if we took 2 of those boy cats up there, they might be able to take care of the chipmunk problem because their mother was a pretty good mouser in the barn. And so that's how Bill and Vito came to the governor's mansion. Now, excuse me, before I get too far into telling you about the book itself, there is a framed quotation on the foyer table at my house. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know who put it there, but it says this: to educate the mind and not educate the heart is no education at all. That's from Aristotle. So we've known that for a long time. I tried to make sure this book did both of those things: educate the mind, the words, the expression, how to pronounce the words, but also to send some messages that might educate the heart. So you will hear, as I go through the book, hopefully you will hear that there are moral teachings that are given to Vito from the birds and the animals that he encounters. I believe that sometimes children will listen to those kind of indirect messages that come from birds and animals better than they would listen to the same messages coming from their parents or from their teachers. So that's the entire purpose of this, is to give them something more than just things to entertain them. Now, true, a lot of children's books, especially for younger children, they are a lot of flashy colors, few words, but in most cases not much moral teachings associated with them. But I didn't want that to be the kind of book this was. So anyway, it starts and it tells a little bit about Bill and Vito growing up on this farm up in Hall County. And then Chris takes them to the governor's mansion and they grow up there. Now I usually get a question from children, well, how old is Vito? And I did not know the answer to that until this past August, when some of my staff, former staff, were celebrating my birthday, and Chris and his wife Bambi were sitting across the table from me, and I told her, I said, I don't know how old Vito is. And she says, well, I can tell you. Some of these ladies are pretty good with those photo cameras and all their stockpile of photographs. In just a little bit, she pulled it up, and there was a picture of Bill and Vito when they were little bitty kittens. And she said they were born on our youngest son's birthday. And I said, well, when was that? She said, May the 25th of 2013. So when children ask me that question, how old is Vito? I tell them he was born on May the 25th, 2013. You tell me how old he is. Make them think, get them involved. Well, I can assure you, if they're below the third grade, they'll just be out there and you can see them thinking and you can see them whispering to each other and everything. They'll probably eventually come up with 11. But if they're past the second grade, I guarantee you there'll be a girl that before you even ask the question says, he's 11. It's always the girls, They're always the ones that's got the answers first. Anyway, he's 11 now. But to back up a bit, when they are at the mansion, they are working around, walking around. They see all these people coming in, visiting the mansion, and they hear a lot of different dialects and a lot of different voices from all the people that are coming in. And they encounter the people who work at the governor's mansion. Now, most of the people who work there were actually inmates in our state prison system. They were brought to the mansion in the mornings, and they were taken back in the evenings after they had finished their working of the day. But not just inmates. Almost without exception, all of the ones who worked at the governor's mansion had been convicted of murder. Now that's sort of shocking to most people because they think of murderers as people that you need to be avoiding. Well, the truth is, the criminal justice system, people will tell you, probably the safest group of inmates are those who have been convicted of murder. Why? Well, because murder is a crime of passion, and usually the perpetrator and the victim know each other. Husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, brother, sister, brother, you name it. Almost the majority of those in our prison system that are convicted of murder, the victim and the perpetrator knew each other. Not talking about mass murderers, that's a totally different type of individual, dangerous individuals. But some of the most dangerous individuals in the prison system are those that are thieves, burglars. If somebody's going to burglarize your house, they're probably going to put your life in danger if you encounter them. But murderers are not in that category. Anyway, one of the individuals that was assigned to work there, I've assigned his name as Dan in the book. Now, I've changed the names of the people to protect the cats. Dan was the most forlorn individual I've ever seen. My wife Sandra was afraid that he was suicidal. He didn't smile. He wouldn't look at anybody. He didn't talk to even the inmates that he rode the bus with. He just stayed to himself all the time. Well, somehow or other, those two cats sensed that this man needed a friend. And you know how cats are. They want to make a friend with you. What do they do? Rub up against your legs. Well, I guess he'd been locked up, and he'd been locked up for 20 years or more before he got to the mansion. I guess he had been locked up so long he didn't know what they were doing, so he would step back away from them at first. But they kept up that attitude of, we want to be your friend. And pretty soon, he reached down and he started petting them, and then he started smiling. Then he started talking to other people. And in the book, there's a picture of Dan with Bill on one shoulder and Vito on the other shoulder. And he would do that. He would walk around the mansion grounds with those two cats on his shoulders. Now, excuse me, when we left office, he was still there, and he couldn't leave. He still had some time to serve before he ultimately became eligible for parole. And in the book, I have Bill and Vito saying goodbye to everybody at the mansion as we are moving to our home up in Habersham County. And in the book, he's crying when they come to say goodbye. And he says, "Your love has brought me peace." Now that's a behind-the-scenes story I need to tell you briefly. One of my good friends from high school, we came all the way from first grade all the way through high school. And he went back home to where I grew up in Sandersville, and he grew up there too. And he always had this saying, it was sort of his salutation to you. "Peace and love, brother, peace and love." And it's on his tombstone, actually. I decided, that's a pretty good mantra, except in this case, I reversed it. Their love, those cats' love, brought him peace. And that's really the way it works sometimes. Love precedes the bringing of peace. So that's one of the little small stories in there. But anyway, we're there. And of course, our term was up in January of 2019, and we had to move. Well, Bill and Vito had to come with us because Governor Kemp and his family, they had big dogs, and they were not friendly dogs. So we had to take Bill and Vito with us. So we asked one of the troopers who was part of our executive security, and the executive security for the first family in Georgia is provided by Georgia State Patrolmen. They don't wear their uniforms, they wear suits. And so his job was to catch Bill and Vito and put them in a crate and put them in the back of the Suburban. You've heard the herding cat story. That was literally that. He'd pick up Bill and he'd put him in the crate, close the door, grab Vito, open the gate, Bill would run out. Back and forth, multiple times. All the other troopers were getting a big kick out of watching him try to do that. But finally he got them both in the same crate, put them in the back of the black Suburban, and he was taken off to go to our house up in Habersham County. And they started yelling. He said they yelled so loud you wouldn't believe how much noise those two cats were making. And so he was telling me this, and he said, I reached back and I say, shh, be quiet. It's just a little while, won't be long. And then he said, all of a sudden I realized I was speaking to them in Arabic. And I tell children that, and I say, why do you think he was speaking to them in Arabic? Well, most children will give you an answer whether they know what the question or the answer really is or not. But that's the one question I have never seen any children even volunteer an answer. So I said, okay, this is your first assignment. When you see a world map in the library or wherever it is, I want you to find why he was speaking Arabic. It's because he was born in the little country of Yemen. So I want you to find where Yemen is on a world map. And Arabic was his native language. Didn't speak English until he was about 11 when he came to the United States. And by the way, on a side note for that, he's called Ali in the book. I told him, I said, I can't use your real name. I don't want to. His real name is Ahmed. And an interesting story in itself. He came from New York State down to the state of Georgia to go to trooper school down in Thompson, in Forsyth, Georgia, where the training center is. And interesting story about him. But he is now an FBI agent in upstate New York, and he calls me at least twice a week just to check on me. He's just one of those kind of guys, you know, the kind we all would like to have in our lives, and I'm proud that he is a part of mine. But anyway, he gets him in the back of the Suburban. He drives up to our house up in Habersham County, opens the back of the Suburban, opens the gate to the crate that they're in. They scoot out of there, scoot out of the Suburban, run up my driveway, and I'm seeing all this. Run up my driveway, and they run in the woods. And we call them, they won't come out. Well, the woods in Habersham County is a lot different than the so-called woods around the governor's mansion. When you're in the woods in Habersham County, you're in the woods. And they will not come out. Well, I wrote it that way, and I took it to the publishing company, and I said, and they came out the next morning when they got hungry, which they did, and they said, well, what did they do in the woods that night? I said, I have absolutely no idea. I told you I had written what I had seen, and I wasn't in the woods with them, so I don't know what they did that night. And their response was, well, we think your readers would like to know. I said, you mean you want me to move from fact into my imagination? They said, yes. And I said, that's dangerous. That is very dangerous to do. Would you like to know what they did in the woods that night? Well, here they are. I tell the children, I said, now you've got to get in the mood for how these two cats, what they're sensing. They're huddled together. They'd never been outside at dark like this. It's getting dark. The wind is blowing the trees, is making shadows in the woods. And all of a sudden they hear this, "Ooh, ooh, who are you?" And Vito looks up and he sees this big gray bird, and he says, he said, "My name is Vito, and this is my brother Bill, and we've never spent the night outside before, and we're scared." And the big bird says, "My name is Oliver. I am the night watchman of this forest." And this is the first moral lesson he teaches them. He says, your courage is a candle in the dark. Don't be afraid. And I asked children, I said, have you ever been alone in the dark before? And of course they all have. Were you scared? Yeah, I was scared. I said, well, do you realize that you have courage down deep inside of you? If you'll call on it, it's like lighting a candle in the dark. You know, they never think about that. They need to think about that. So anyway, they feel a little bit better, you know, having been told that he's going to watch over them, this great big gray owl. And then all of a sudden they see this figure coming through the woods, coming toward them, closer and closer. And then it says, "Hello, my name is Raquel. I'm a raccoon. Am I pretty?" Vito says she was. Those big black circles around her eyes made them shine, and when she brushed her coat with her hands, it sparkled in the moonlight. And he says, "Hands? You got hands like people." And she says, "Yes, and I wash my hands and I wash my food in the creek before I eat. You should try that sometime." I had a parent come up to me afterwards and said, I'm afraid that my daughter's going to insist on washing her hands in the creek from now on. That's not the point. But anyway, I've got to tell you the story behind Raquel. How many of you knew Walt Snelling? I know Phil and Judy did. Walt Snelling was a good friend of mine. He was one of the first friends I made when I got out of the Army in 1968 and came to Gainesville to practice law, and remained my friend for his entire life. He was a big guy. He tried to lose weight. You'd see him walking up and down the streets of Gainesville trying to get his exercise to make sure he didn't get too overweight. But he had this shtick about him. He was prematurely bald, and in JC's, young men in those days, you know how they tease each other and give everybody nicknames. Well, they nicknamed him Chrome Dome. Well, he wasn't insulted by that. He took it as a compliment, you know. So he was one of those kind of guys. But he had this shtick about him that if he saw a woman standing somewhere, he may or may not know her, especially if she had a man or two standing around her, husband or otherwise. He'd walk up to the woman and he would say, "My name is Robert Redford. You must be Raquel." Well, to most of us in our day, that was Raquel Welch, the epitome of feminine beauty. Well, obviously that broke the ice and everybody would laugh and smile, and that was his way of saying things. I told that story somewhere on a book tour across the state of Georgia, and this lady came up to me and she says, "I very well remember Walt, and I remember the way he did things," and said he came to an occasion in our JC chapter and I had made him a name tag that said Robert Redford, and said he wore that thing and wore it forever because that was the way he introduced himself. So that's the story behind Raquel. Now this is the one line in my book I thought I would have cut. As she starts to leave, she whispers to Bill and Vito, "Why don't you boys come see me sometime?" I thought sure that the publishers would cut that, and I said, "Why didn't you cut it?" They said, "Well, because every good children's book always needs at least one thing in there that only the adults understand." So that's my Mae West line that I got away with in the book. But then she saunters on off into the darkness, and then it's quiet for a while. And then they hear this strange voice. "To be or not to be, that is the question. Allow me to introduce myself. The name is Percival, but you may call me Percy." And Bill says, "What are you?" And he says, "An actor, of course, but also a possum. More correctly, an opossum, but no one seems to use the proper King's English anymore." Well, now what in the world does a possum who speaks with a British accent, what lesson does he teach to children? And I had to think about these things. Any character I used, I wanted them to have a message behind what they were teaching Vito. The message behind Percival is this: too many boys don't think they're handsome enough. Too many girls don't think they're pretty enough, and therefore they never develop their personalities. I asked children, I said, "Have you ever seen a possum?" Most of them have. I have a feeling most of them are dead on the side of the road, you know. And I said, is a possum a pretty animal like Raquel was a pretty animal? "Oh no, possum's not very pretty." Well, they're not. But I said, the lesson you need to learn from Percival is he has developed his personality. And that's what you need to do. Develop your personality, and that will make you memorable, just like Percy is memorable. So anyway, they get through the rest of the night, and they come out in the morning just like I predicted they would. And as they come down to our house, we are on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, and there's a Class 3 rapids in the backyard, and it's got white water, and it's on the back cover of the book. The water turns white and it makes the sound. And as they come down, they'd never heard this sound before. And they listen and listen, and they decide they like that sound. In fact, they decide it sounds like them when they're happy and content. They purr. And they decided that was the river that was purring. And in the book, Vito sits with his friend the river, and they purr together. But anyway, so over the next year or so, the two of them, they take off every morning. They'll go hunting together. And then they'll come back at night, get fed, and we put them in the garage and close them up for the night. Well, one morning, we were going out, and we saw Bill lying in the driveway. And Sandra asked me, says, go check on him. He liked to sun himself. He especially liked to sun himself on the back of our house, which was on the riverside of our house. In the afternoons, that's the western sun comes, and he would lie there and sun himself. He really liked that. He had told Vito one time, he said, one of these days, I'm going to follow that sunset, and I'm going to find out where it goes. And I'll be warm, and I'll have beautiful skies over my head all the time. Well, when Bill is lying in the driveway, I pick him up and put him in my car, and I drive off. Originally, I had written, I said that I pronounced that Bill was dead. The publisher said, that's too harsh. You can't say to children that he died. And I'm thinking, what kind of children are these anyway, But anyhow, I softened it. So let me tell you what my softened version of that was. As Vito is sitting there watching me go off with Bill, a cardinal comes and lands on the branch of a tree next to where Vito is sitting. And the cardinal says, I'm a messenger. I've come to tell you that Bill's journey here is ended, but he's doing what he always wanted to do. He's following the sunset. And one day, when your journey is ended, you'll join him and you'll follow the sunset together. Soft enough? Soft enough. Okay. But anyway, Vito's by himself now. And a change in personality occurred immediately. When Sandra and I would go walking, he would walk with us, just like a dog would do. He'd never done that before. He'd always go off with Bill and they'd go hunting. Now he was with us all the time. And he started talking all the time. I mean, constantly trying to tell us something. But he was lonesome. That's what it was. He was lonesome. So one night, he heard, ooh, ooh, ooh. And he decides to go talk to Oliver and see what Oliver can tell him. So he goes up and he tells Oliver, he says, Bill and I were born at the same time, but he was always bigger than me. He always took the lead and I followed him. And now he's gone and I'm by myself and I'm afraid. And Oliver tells him, you remember the first night in the woods when I told you your courage was a candle in the dark? Now I'm telling you, your courage is a shield in the light. Go and make friends. So he decides he'll take him up on that advice. He was always a little bit afraid of the river because, as he says, cats don't like water. And that's, if you have an experience with cats, they don't like to get wet usually. So he'd stayed away from the river. But this time he decided Oliver's telling him to make friends, so he's going to go down closer to the river. And he gets down there and he gets close enough and he sees this brownish gray stick standing in the shallow water. He'd never noticed that stick there before, but as he gets closer, he realizes it's not a stick, it's a bird. So he goes up to this bird and he says, hello, my name is Vito. And this bird, standing real still, turns around and says, shh, be quiet. Stands back still, not moving. And Vito says, what are you doing? She says, my name is Helen, I'm a heron and I'm fishing. Turns back around, stands real still, real still. Vito says, "Why are you being so still?" And she says, "You need to learn to be patient." Vito says, "What is patience?" So here's the lesson. She says, patience is when you wait for things to happen instead of trying to make them happen. We all need to learn that lesson, don't we? I have to remind myself about Helen's message. Children in particular need to learn that there are times to be quiet, there are times to be still, and there are times to be patient. Vito does that for a while, and he decides he's going to practice being patient somewhere else. So he starts walking back away from the river back toward the house, and all of a sudden something sticks him. And he says, "Ow!" And he looks around, and there's this strange little creature. And it says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to stick you. I stumbled in the grass, and one of my quills stuck you. Please forgive me." He says, "Well, what are you?" And she says, "I'm a porcupine. My name is Priscilla, but you may call me Prissy." Well, she was so nice. Vito and Prissy, they start talking about things and having a good time just being friends. And Vito says, "You know, I like to run through the woods and jump over the creek." And Prissy says, "I can't do that. My body will not let me do that." And Vito thinks about it, and he says, "That's okay. We can still be friends." That's the important lesson for children to learn. Your friends don't always have to look like you. They don't always have to be able to do the same things that you can do, or vice versa. But you can still be friends. That's a very important lesson for children and for all of us to learn. Well, he decides it's probably really time for him to get back up to the house. And all of a sudden he hears this grumbling and growling, and it's coming on the book. On the back cover, there's a wooden deck, and there is a wooden deck there on the banks of the river. And there's an animal walking on the railing of that deck. It's like a 2x4 railing up there. And he's hoping that it's Raquel, because he'd like to talk to her again, but he realizes it's not Raquel. This is an animal that's grumbling and growling and talking to itself and just angry. And so he gets a little closer to it and he says, "Hello, my name is Vito." And this animal says, "Whoa," almost falls off the railing. He says, "What are you doing? I don't have many visitors down here." And he says, "Well, I'm trying to make friends. I live in the house up there." And he said, "Oh, well, I don't have many friends." And Vito says, "Well, what are you?" He says, "I'm a groundhog. My name is Gregory. They call me Grumpy." And he is indeed grumpy. Everything goes wrong. He's complaining about this, complaining about that. And Vito starts asking him questions, trying to be friendly, and finally Grumpy gets tired of answering his questions, and he says, "You sure do ask a lot of questions." And Vito says, "Well, I'm just trying to make friends." And he says, "Well, you've got it made. Those people up there on the hill, they feed you and give you a warm place to sleep. Me, I have to dig my house up in the bank underneath this deck." And sure enough, there is a groundhog up under the deck, and I have seen him walking on the railing there. And so they talk about that, and Vito says, "Well, I'd like to see your house sometimes." And he says, "Well, you come back and I'll show you my house." And so as a result of talking with him, Grumpy, as Vito starts to leave, go back to the house, instead of being growling and complaining and talking to himself real loud, angry voices, he hears Grumpy is singing. The lesson there is pretty obvious. We all meet a lot of grumpies in our life, don't we? People that always are complaining, nothing's ever right, and they don't want to be friends with anybody. But if we take the time and devote the energy to it, we can become friends. And instead of growling all the time, they can sing. So that's the lesson of those animals. Now, this has been a very popular book, fortunately. I was surprised when the publishing company asked us, how many you want to order for the first order? And Carrie was handling all of this conversations for me. And she asked me, I said, well, maybe 200. I said, I have friends who publish their books, and their trunk of their car is still full of books, and their closets in their house are still full of books. I don't want to be in that situation. So she said, well, 200, that's not nearly enough. I said, well, how many are you going to order? I think you ordered 2,000. I thought, I'm going to have riding around with the back of my car still full of books forever. Well, fortunately, that has not been the case. It's become a very popular book. We had a request from the mayor of the city of Baldwin, a little small community there in Habersham County, have a very heavy Hispanic population in their school system. She asked us if we had a Spanish edition of the book, and we did not at the time, but through her efforts and putting us in contact with people, we do have a Spanish-English version. And it's a unique layout in that up at the top half of the page is the Spanish version, and at the bottom is the English version of the same information that's in the book. So that it's really usable for anybody, whichever language is their predominant language and they're trying to learn the other one, they can make that transition. So it's been somewhat popular. I think it will become even more popular in the school systems, and that's what she wanted it for. She bought about 100 and gave them away to the citizens there in Baldwin. And then, several months after all that, a fellow comes to my house, and he had been an inmate at the governor's mansion when I was there, and got to be good friends with him. He had learned how to Braille, and there is a Braille teaching facility within the prison system. It's at the men's Macon facility, Macon Prison, and he had learned that Brailing, and even before he was paroled, he had started his own company doing Braille work. He actually had a contract with Georgia Tech to do Braille work for them while he was an inmate in the state prison system. Now you talk about having initiative and being willing to take advantage of a second chance. He got out and has his own company, and so he came to my house and he presented me Braille copies of this book. And so we have worked with the Academy for the Blind and through the state organization to work with schools that do provide Braille for visually impaired students in their system. So it's become, more widespread than I would have ever thought that it would be. Call time on me if you need to. I'll be glad to try to I'll be glad to try to answer any questions if you might have any.
Before we have questions, am I on? No. Before we have questions, as you leave, not that you're going to leave right now, but it's not on. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. There's a display. What? Got it.
Isn't technology great?
I live here for a reason. There's a display of photos that Paula brought of your experiences with Governor Deal. So make sure you have a chance to see the photos. And after questions, would you be over here as well?
Okay. We'll be selling copies of the book.
So now, raise your hand if you have questions and wait for the mic, please.
just out of curiosity, this sounds like a great book. What's your next offering?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have anything. I did start on writing my memoirs, and if you will indulge me a minute, I'll tell you how I started. I started chronologically. I know that's not really the way you're supposed to necessarily do memoirs and so forth, but and some of you know the person I'm about to talk about, Harris Blackwood. Harris is a strange character, but he was a friend of mine. He worked for me when I was in the governor's office, and did a great job in the position I put him in. And he writes for the Times. You'll see his articles from time to time in the newspaper. I knew he had published a few books. He self-published a few. So I had written the beginnings of my biography, and and I asked him, I said, well, let me read you this. And I read him what I'd written. I hadn't written a whole lot. And he said, well, you've got the perfect hook. I said, hook? What do you mean hook? He said, well, you've got to have something early on in a book like that to get people's attention so that they'll read the rest of it. And I said, well, what is my hook? He said, you can start it off by saying, it took me 3 years to get out of the first grade, which is true. But I'm not as dumb as that makes me sound. When my parents moved to Sandersville, I had been born in Jenkins County down in Millen, and the reason that I was born there is because they lived in Scriven County, and Scriven County didn't have a hospital, so that was the nearest hospital. And when I was 3 years old, the school that my daddy was the principal of burned, and they went to Sandersville in Washington County. Well, the school superintendent in Washington County at that time had previously been the superintendent over in Treutlen County, over in Soperton, and my parents had both taught there. And so he knew them and knew that they were teachers. My daddy already had a job. That's what brought us to Sandersville. But my mother had me, and I was 3 years old. So he calls her up because he was desperate for a first grade school teacher. And she says, well, you know, I've got Nathan, and we didn't have any family anywhere close by at all. And there were no daycare centers or things like that in those days. And she said, what would I do with Nathan? Well, she just wouldn't accept taking a job. So he was still so desperate, he calls her back up and he says, well, I've got the perfect solution. He said, you just bring Nathan with you, and we'll put a little desk in the back corner of your classroom, and he can just stay back there. I did that for 2 years until I got old enough to go across the hall to the only other first grade school teacher, and Miss Ellen Bradley was my first grade school teacher. So it did take me 3 years to get out of the first grade. That's enough said about my biography. Got a question over here.
Where did you develop your ability as a storyteller?
I'm a politician. What else would you say about that? That's the best experience and background you could possibly have. And there are two parts to that answer. But thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, you've been very kind to host me here this morning. Thank you so much. And if you want to get a copy of the book, I'll be glad to personalize it for you, and I hope you will enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an honor to have you visit with us today.
One thing I need to tell you. First of all, if you buy it and you're going to read it to children, you have to learn to give these animals and birds voices. And that's true, because if you don't give them the personality that they deserve to convey the messages that they're trying to convey. And Vito signed the book already. All right. That's his paw print, and that is his picture of Vito. So I gave one of my granddaughters the assignment of getting Vito's signature, so she did it.
And
Thank you all.
what do the books cost?
The hardbacks are $20, and we have a softback that is $12, and we have that multi-language, English, Spanish, is $15.
And then we also have the note cards.
And we have some note cards that Cheryl Hodge was kind enough to use her art to make note cards too.
And I can take credit cards too if you need to.
Yes.
Cash credit cards.
I can't take credit cards, but she knows how to do that, so thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.